Good morning and welcome to the our sitting together. And I just delight in seeing all the all the names, all the names and all the places that you're logging on from. Thank you. As a way of introducing the meditation session today, I would like to say that in the teachings of the Buddha, he uses a lot of metaphors, and particular metaphors from nature. And those metaphors are meant to give a more holistic sense, feeling, intuition, embodiment of what the teachings are. And in terms of meditation practice, one of the most common metaphors he used is water. Often the idea of water that's flowing, or very clear, or very refreshing water, cool, refreshing water. All kinds of water metaphors. And one of the ones that I'm particularly fond of is that of the water flowing in a river. And the idea is the other one I like is the idea of a plant growing. We don't force a plant to grow, we create the conditions for it. And then we get in a certain kind of way, we get out of the way for the plant so it can come. A river which is blocked, a river which has a lot of obstacles, the Buddha talked about having makes lots of noise, like a creek kind of gurgling and cascading. But a river that has no obstacles, that's large and strong and flowing, can have a kind of quiet, he said, kind of silence flow. And so for meditation today, this idea that there's a river of life within us that flows, and a lot of what meditation is getting out of the way, allowing, and this deep, deep allowing, this willingness to allow our experience to be what it is, and to learn the art of getting out of the way, which means somehow not having our preferences, our desires, our resistance in the way of the breath as it breathes in and out, as the flow of sensations in the body move through us, as sounds come in. The idea is to allow what's deep inside to flow. I like the example, the idea of letting what's deep inside that's kind of beyond or greater than any small sense of self that we have, idea of me, myself, and mine, to let that make room for it, open up for it, and allow it to flow, allow it to express itself. So with that as a background, the idea that our experience is a river, and for us, our job is to stay in the river, but not put any obstacles in it, to flow along with it. And the more we enter the river, enter the stream, enter the current, the less we'll be self-preoccupied. So, taking a meditation posture, and closing your eyes, and taking immediately, noticing what's happening for you now. Without even beginning the meditation, what already do you notice is flowing, moving, happening? What's happening in your body? What's happening in your heart with your emotions? What's happening in your mind, thoughts? And how much of that you're experiencing now, what percentage of it is all about somehow you as the agent, having you as the reference point of your preferences, your desires, your fears, about me, myself, and mine. And there's nothing wrong with that, except it does obscure the flow of change, the flow and dynamism of being alive. Getting involved in thoughts and stories and past and future all too easily obscures and maybe interrupts the flow of the river, the flow of experience. And so taking a few long, slow, deep breaths. And as you exhale, relaxing the thinking mind, softening your preferences, whatever physical sense of anxiety or self-concern that may be there for good reason, but for now, it's okay to let it rest, to relax the thinking muscle, to relax that muscle of self that is often activated, so that it's okay for these minutes of meditation just to be. It's okay not to be self-concerned. And taking a few long, slow, deep breaths. And as you exhale, relaxing the body, softening in the body. And even when the body is uncomfortable, the body becomes something we can trust, we can rest in. The body itself is kind of an alternative to excessive self-concern. The self-concern which is okay for the minutes of meditation, to lessen, to quiet, and instead to enter awareness into the body. Letting the breathing return to normal. And as if you can ride the exhale, ride it like a wave to the end where it's quiet and peaceful. Gently, for a moment, ride the exhale. And as you do so, allow the thinking mind to become quieter. Relaxing the muscles of the face. Relaxing the shoulders. Relaxing the belly. And any sense in your body that you're bracing yourself against life, bracing yourself against the unknown. Perhaps for these few minutes it's okay to relax, soften the whole body, so that the sensations of your body, the flow and changing sensations of breathing, the the sensations that are your vitality, the sensations that are part of your life coursing through you. That you open to feel it. And as you will stay present, come back to the present. Come back to a kind of allowing, where you allow the immediacy of life, the immediacy of breathing, the immediacy of the experience of your body, to allow itself to allow it to express itself, to flow, and you flowing in the river of the present moment. Everything that's happening is in fact part of the flow of the river of life. Everything we're experiencing here in the meditation, if something is not experienced as a process, as change, as movement, as a flow, chances are you're fixated with your thoughts. You're thinking too much about it, or too involved in your thoughts. Let your thinking become quieter. Maybe you can even allow your thinking to become slower. Maybe even pauses between your thoughts. And in the space beyond your thoughts, between your thoughts, there perhaps is where the expression of life can flow through you. as we come to the end of this sitting, to take a few moments to aspire to have your care and goodness, your love, be something that spreads from outwards to include the others you know, those for whom it's easy to have goodwill, care, and to let go of the clinging that causes the tension that blocks our love. To soften the resistance that doesn't allow love to flow. To soften the clinging that doesn't allow us to receive and give freely. And to whatever degree that you can care, love, maybe you can aspire to express it into the world, maybe even in ways that other people can't see, because it's private acts, secret acts of love and kindness that you do. May it be that this meditation we have done be a source from which we care for the welfare and happiness of the people around us, the people we'll see today, talk to today, and become aware of today through all the different ways that we learn about the world. May our meditation be a support for the well-being and the happiness and peace of all beings everywhere. So, good morning, and this is the third talk in a series of 5 to discuss the first of the 4 Noble Truths, the Noble Truth of suffering. And the task of this truth is to understand suffering. It's a call to stop and take a good look. The bumper sticker for Buddhists could be, I stop for suffering, in the sense that this is really something to look at and to be with and looking. But it can seem that this emphasis on suffering lends itself to despair, to discouragement, because, that's what's supposed to do, just suffer more, just look at the suffering which is so difficult to have. A good number of years ago, I learned of a woman who, when she was a teenager, she lived in this general area, I think maybe in a place called Menlo Park near here. In the 1960s, she grew up there as a teenager, and Menlo Park was one of these centers for uh, the Grateful Dead, Ken Kesey, the Merry Pranksters, kind of the one part of the bubbling up, the origins of the whole psychedelic movement. So I don't know if it was connected to that, but her and her high school friends, two other young women, had heard that there was a Zen teacher in San Francisco who could teach them how to get high without taking psychedelics, without taking drugs. And so they traveled up to San Francisco, it was about 35 miles, I think, up to San Francisco to see Shunryo Suzuki Roshi, the founder of San Francisco Zen Center, Suzuki Roshi. When he was in Japantown, a little temple in Japanese for the Japanese community and part of before he started Zen Center. So maybe it was 1965 or something. And they came. He would receive them, and they told him why they were there. They'd heard that he could teach them how to be how to get high without taking any drugs. And he sat down, welcomed them in, and he proceeded to give them a teaching about the Four Noble Truths. The truth of suffering, the truth of the arising of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the practice leading to the cessation of suffering. Well, this was not what these young women had gone to San Francisco to learn, to get this lecture about suffering. However, this Zen teacher, as he was talking about suffering, he was just so happy. And the incongruity of suffering, talking about suffering and being so happy, was the reason why one of those three then went on to become a Zen student and was a Zen student for many, many years. So yes, Buddhism does emphasize suffering, the looking at it, the honest assessment of it, a real kind of not turning away, not shutting down, not pretending it's differently, or making some kind of romantic view of reality that doesn't really recognize the severity, the seriousness, the scale of suffering that human beings experience. It's in that sense, Buddhism is meant to be quite realistic. And at the same time, the Buddha also emphasized happiness and was known to be a very happy person and referred to the people who had engaged in the practice of freedom from suffering as the happy ones. And if you read the teachings of the Buddha, the instructions the Buddha gave for a path to the end of suffering, that path is a happy path. He emphasized doing the things that cultivated happiness, gladness, joy, some people call it rapture, a variety of forms of well-being. And that in that cultivation of well-being, of happiness, that creates the conditions to be able to really be with suffering, look at suffering in the deepest kind of way. It prepares the ground for a person to be able to see suffering in its depth, in its fullness. The suffering of human beings has layers and layers and layers. And often what we see on the surface, and what we can identify as kind of our immediate suffering, has deep tentacles, deep roots inside. And to really go deep, deep down inside, to feel the core, central suffering of our lives, that which maybe has been our companion for a lifetime, that which doesn't come and go, but really, if you're really quiet and still, can really feel the deepest attachments, the deepest things that we care most about, or are most scared about, or most resist. To really go down there, that's the task of practice. But to do that in a deep way the idea is to do it from a place of well-being, of tremendous stability, being grounded, and having happiness and joy as part of it. And that certainly was true for me in some of the biggest insights or biggest kind of encounters with suffering I've ever had in my life, which was in deep meditation practice. That it was kind of a paradox because I had so much happiness and joy at that point that happiness and joy became the container, the ground, the foundation with which to be present for suffering. Now, I don't say this with the implication it's easy and that it's accessible, but I'm saying this as an encouragement that this Buddhist practice is not only about sitting with suffering. In popular culture, there's often the idea that the First Noble Truth says that life is suffering. And the Buddha never said that. That's not really a Buddhist teaching. Unless the teachings are understood as being within life, there is suffering. And maybe you want to put it in parentheses or put it in bold, and there's also happiness. And that's why translating dukkha as painful, life is painful, for many people lends itself more to the idea that that's only, yes, of course it's painful in certain times and places and ways, but there's much more to that adjective, much more to that aspect, that character of life. Life can also be happy. And the Buddha not only emphasized that the path to freedom from suffering is a happy one, he also emphasized that those who had gone through to the other side, to the end of suffering, they were the happy ones. And he used the word sukha, sukho. They were the happy ones. And so some people have a certain kind of contentment, happiness, a feeling of rightness, that knowing that there is a path, there's a way, there's a practice that can, where we can be honestly present for how difficult life is for us. And just to know that this is possible, there's a path, this is well known, people have been doing this since the time of the Buddha. The sufferings that we have today are maybe a different scale because we have so many more people in the world in the time of the Buddha. So in that sense, the aggregate perhaps feels bigger. But it's the same suffering as the time of the Buddha, that in some ways is not much different than before. And the Buddha lived in a time of much suffering. The historical analysis of what happened near the end of the Buddha's life is that his social world was collapsing. Kingdoms were being usurped and countries were going to war, and his senior disciples were dying, and he was an old man with a very bad back, quite sick. His world was kind of falling apart. And he died peacefully. He died at peace, he died happily, he died in a very deep, wonderful state of meditation. He was able to find a happy way, a peaceful way, that could coexist with the suffering of the world. He wasn't burdened by that suffering, but he was realistic about it. He didn't take it on his shoulders as being that he's responsible for it, but he was responsive to it and addressed it. So this idea that, yes, there is suffering and there is happiness. Now, to hear that life is suffering can be distressing, discouraging, and as I said, that's not really a Buddhist teaching. But to hear on the other side that the path to the end of suffering involves happiness and joy can also be distressing, because sometimes happiness and joy is not accessible. Life is so difficult, so overwhelming. Life experiences have been so amazingly challenging that it just, the pain that we live in and the fear that we live in is so overwhelming. And so, so yes, we recognize that. But then to prepare ourselves to do the deeper work of Buddhist meditation practice, we have to prepare ourselves. We have to get ready to know that, yes, we're going in that, this is the direction, that's the North Star, to cultivate a sense of relaxation, peace, happiness. And what does it take to get there? And often it begins with a very simple grounding, a care and a tenderness for ourselves, and taking into account what our challenges are, and figuring out a gentle way, a kind way, a supportive way to be present and learn to be with what is there. And there's no hurry in Buddhism. We're not supposed to dive in and address suffering immediately, but to begin kind of maybe on the edges of it, and get from the edges get a kind of realistic assessment of what we're up against. And then to do the things that are supportive to create a foundation for addressing the suffering at the right time. So one of the key things that part of the Buddhist tradition, key foundations, is to live an ethical life, and really work carefully at not only the obvious ways of being ethical, but the more subtle and nuanced ways with how we speak, to speak honestly and speak kindly, not to speak harshly or angrily, to practice generosity and start being generous. I've known people who are really, a friend of mine who was very, very challenged psychologically with difficult psychological states of fear and distress. And her Buddhist teacher gave her the practice of being generous. And she, in small ways, she started going around, and wherever she could, she would help a little bit and do things for people. And just small ways. And it made such a big difference for her. And so you do, and the thing about ethics, the sila, it's actually things that you can do or not do. And it doesn't really require your inner state to be any different. It just means behaving differently. And behaving differently makes a huge difference. Some people go and volunteer at an animal shelter or at a homeless shelter or anywhere. Some people, so this idea of our behavior, generosity, kindness, ethics, these are the ways to begin gently on the side, to begin laying the foundation. And the Buddha talked about when we feel really confident in that we're ethical, that then there's the bliss of blamelessness, a certain kind of happiness about at least our behavior is okay, even though inside things are hard. And then to cultivate contentment, to learn the art of being content with what we have. Of course, there's sometimes we have less than we need, less than maybe we're ideal, and challenged in poverty and out of work and things like that. But even so, can we in moments of the day cultivate contentment? Contentment with this moment, contentment with this particular activity we're doing, and not be wrapped up in it has to be different, anger and resistance and fear. To cultivate some realistic kind of contentment with what we have is part of the path that begins laying a foundation. And then to practice with the hindrances, to understand something about how the hindrances operate in us, and how we get caught in them. And as we stop getting caught in the hindrances, our core suffering might still be there, but we're not adding more suffering on top of it. And then there can be a certain kind of joy, contentment, gladness, that we're not always being caught in our reactivity. And then there's mindfulness of the body, to keep getting grounded, to get our sea legs and really stand here and be balanced and here, present. To begin trusting the flow of our experience to be here, not resisting, not wanting, not so caught up in the reification, the solidification of self around that thinking keeps doing. And to do it in small dosages, just to begin opening and opening. So when suffering is big, then this is the medicine. When suffering is not so big, or when we have the foundation already, then we keep practicing and cultivating and looking for the places where there can be well-being. Looking for how to grow well-being in a realistic way. And part of that is to recognize how often there is some sense of well-being. If you walk out of your home today, and if it happens to be a sunny day and a nice day, it's possible to be so preoccupied and caught up we don't notice. It's also possible to walk out and take some moments to appreciate the nice day, to appreciate the clear air, appreciate perhaps the sun, the warmth if there is. Look for opportunities to appreciate the life you have, not as a denial of suffering, but so that happiness and suffering can coexist. Finally, I'd like to say a little saying. If you want to address suffering, call on the support of happiness. If you want to support your happiness, address your suffering. So those two together. Address suffering with the support of happiness. Support happiness by addressing your suffering. And they go back and forth. And with that, I hope that you'll go deep to the end of suffering. So thank you for this morning, and I look forward to our chance to be together tomorrow.